Hi, my name is Mindy Grossenbacher. I am a graduate student at Emporia State University, specializing in instructional design and technology. Today I'd like to speak with you about accessibility in distance learning. We'll be going over why accessibility is needed, what accessibility is, and how you can incorporate accessibility into your distance learning classroom, even if you are not an expert in accessibility practices. Accessibility is important because 1 in 5 of your learners has a disability. If you sit back and think about your current student population, can you identify which learners in your classroom are working with a disability? Within your classroom, you might encounter students falling into 4 categories of disability. The first is visual involvement. Students in this category may be blind, legally blind, or they may be colorblind. Next, we might see students in the auditory involvement category. These students are deaf or hard of hearing. Another category is cognitive involvement. Students in this category may have learning disabilities, autism, mental retardation, cerebral palsy, or traumatic brain injury. And finally, students might be in the mobility involvement category. These students may have paralysis, traumatic brain injury, spina bifida, authorities, or muscular disorders. As you can see, some students may even fall into more than one category. These students are protected to ensure that they will receive an equal opportunity of education just like their peers. First, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act ensures that all students with disabilities will receive a free and appropriate education. Special education and related services are available to them. Next, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, provides protections for students with disabilities. Section 504 is enforced by OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, in public elementary and secondary schools. Finally, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Title II, is supported by the OCR, who enforces Title II, providing protection against discrimination to the full range of state and local government services, programs, and activities, whether or not programs receive any federal financial assistance. Enforcement for Title II is also shared with the U.S. Department of Justice. According to the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability. Most likely, you will encounter a student with a disability in every class you teach. But creating an accessible environment doesn't have to be an overwhelming task for you or your learner. So what can we use to create content that is accessible? We might use accessible educational materials, such as print and technology-based materials. Outside of print, these materials could come in the form of electronic textbooks. They also could come in the format of digital, graphic, audio, or even video materials. We might also use accessible formats that provide the same information in another form. For example, we might use audio, braille, large print, tactile graphics, or digital text that conforms with accessibility standards. Working with distance learning, you might often use accessible technologies. These are hardware devices and software that provide learners with access to the content in accessible digital materials. Accessible technologies are universally designed programs that are flexible and benefit all learners. Finally, you may use assistive technologies which do not necessarily fall into the category of accessible technology. These assistive technologies are helpful in adapting content for certain disabilities. However, one should be careful designing with assistive technologies in mind, since not all students may have these technologies available to them. Also, assistive technologies often provide assistance after content is created. Assistive technologies you might use or see your students using include text to speech, screen readers, and speech recognition. To help us administer these accessible materials and technologies appropriately, it is helpful to follow the POUR principles provided by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. The POUR principles are standards and guidelines for ensuring accessibility in digital materials and technologies.
Welcome to Designing for Accessibility from the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. Many of the authoring tools available to educators now include options for adding accessibility into the content creation workflow. And standards such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide guidance for how to do so. However, these guidelines often include technical language that can be confusing to even veteran developers. Fortunately, a set of simpler principles, as captured by the acronym POUR, provide a better starting point. POUR stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust, 4 qualities that define an accessible user experience. Perceivable content is presented in a way that it can be accessed with more than one sense. This accounts for both the needs of people with disabilities and those who are accessing the content in less than optimal environmental conditions. One example is the inclusion of closed captions and transcripts for video content. This will make the video more accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It will also make it possible for anyone to enjoy the content in loud environments where it would otherwise be inaccessible, such as while commuting on a train or a bus. Operable content in digital materials can be operated with a variety of input methods, ranging from the mouse to the keyboard and even speech commands. It also means options for navigation are provided. If the content of a digital material is marked up correctly, screen reader users can use a keyboard shortcut to bring up a list of headings. Using these headings, they can skip to the desired section without the need to listen to an entire page. Understandable content in digital materials is presented in a logical and predictable way as the user navigates through its various sections, and supports for language, such as explanations of unfamiliar terms, are included or easily accessible. Robust digital materials are compatible across platforms and work well with a range of assistive technologies. Designing digital materials according to widely supported standards will make it more likely that these materials will continue to work as intended as new delivery technologies are adopted. The National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at aem.cas.org is your go-to resource for technical assistance. Together, we can develop and use learning materials that address learner variability and provide better opportunities for learning to all.
So how can we make our content more accessible? First, we can recognize the disabilities represented among our student populations. Next, we need to remember that all students can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as students without disabilities. We then must find the formats that best fit the needs of our students, whether that is through accessible materials, accessible formats, or accessible technologies. Finally, we need to use the POUR principles to implement accessibility into our classroom and content appropriately. Thank you for taking the time to find out how you can create a more accessible platform within your classroom and throughout distance education. For more information on these issues, as well as programs to help you implement accessibility, please see the resources I have shared. These resources provide a great starting point to begin your accessibility journey.